Jason, why do you hate the sumo deadlift so much? This is a question I got asked earlier because I've made some negative statements about the sumo deadlifts. And I should go ahead and answer that because I haven't covered that in a while. The short answer is because every time you do a sumo deadlift, God kills a puppy. Now, the facetiousness and joking aside, I don't hate sumo deadlifts. And no, I don't believe that God actually kills a puppy every time you do a sumo deadlift. But the point is that for most purposes, people deadlift for general size, general strength, not necessarily for competitive powerlifting. And I'll get to competitive powerlifting in a minute. But for general size and strength, slightly longer range of motion variations of exercises usually do a better job of building more overall muscle mass, building more overall strength, and our exercise selection needs to balance things out. And the problem we have is that the sumo deadlift versus a conventional, the sumo deadlift, depending upon your height, removes somewhere between 12 and 15% of the range of motion of the exercise. In other words, it's a shorter lift. It's a shorter lift. You're cutting down range of motion. Now, for some people, that adds a tremendous amount of additional weight that they can lift, which would be fine if your goal is grip strength. But if you're trying to build overall strength, you're moving several muscle groups, potentially with less total loading on them. So that can become a small problem, but that's not really my biggest issue with it. That's more of my issue on the competitive end with it. My primary issue with the exercise, and don't get me wrong, I would rather someone do sumo deadlift than not deadlift at all. So let me get that point clear also. But the point has to do with the muscle emphasis and overall muscle balance. The problem we have is that most people who train, even people who train legs, tend to be slightly quad dominant. Particularly women, and that's the worst part, is that we see so many women who do the sumo deadlift instead of the conventional now, and I think due to popularity of stuff on the internet. But the problem we have is that most people who train legs tend to be quad dominant. They neglect things like their hamstrings and to some extent their spinal erectors, and then they'll do something like a deadlift and assume that will correct it. And in a lot of cases, the deadlift is a fantastic tool for developing the hamstrings and lower back. The problem is that the sumo deadlift shifts the ratios, because if you perform a sumo deadlift correctly, it's almost a squat. If you look at how anyone who's a strong sumo puller pulls, what do? They squat down. They squat about 4 to 6 inches above a meat legal squat, and then they squat the weight off the floor. In other words, they use tremendously more quadricep than hamstring to break the weight off the floor. And again, just watch anyone, you can see the biomechanics yourself. In other words, it's a more quad and hip dominant deadlift that uses less hamstring and less lower back. The issue we have here is that most people are already squatting. Most people who deadlift squat also. And if you're squatting already, you're already doing a lower body lift that's quad and hip dominant. Your posterior chain, and particularly your hamstrings, tend to lag. And so if you pick a deadlift that hits the quads again more than the hamstrings, we're right back to the same training problem we ran into before. All right, and in the long term, if that is your primary hamstring exercise, you're not doing additional posterior chain work, such as a glute ham raise, which would be my first choice, or Romanian deadlifts, or something else, some other big exercise that's going to work the hamstrings, and then doing additional lower back work, you might be neglecting these areas. And it's not just an aesthetic issue. Yeah, for people who compete in aesthetic endeavors, that could be an issue. That's not the only issue. The real issue becomes one of muscle imbalance. It becomes one of muscle imbalance. Being quad dominant leads to higher rates of hamstring tears in various endeavors. When you sprint, when you play field sports, when you play contact sports, it leaves you more predisposed to hamstring tears. So there's an issue with hamstring weakness, there's an issue with knee joint stability, all of these things. And the problem is that you're now using a deadlift variation. You're using a deadlift variation that is putting you back to more quad dominance, which the squats already cause. Because, I mean, squats work your hamstrings also, leg presses work your hamstrings also, but they work tremendously more quad. Now, the sumo deadlift works the hamstrings more than these exercises, but we're getting such a massive overlap that we're not getting carryover. And, you know, we can only recover from so many big compound movements. And if we're selecting compound movements, there are variations of them that cause an enormous overlap in the primary muscles work, so much so that we are neglecting major muscle groups. This isn't a balanced training, and that's really more of my issue with the sumo deadlift. Is this virtually everyone who deadlifts does squats of some type, you know, with some exceptions. Obviously there are exceptions to that rule. I mean, you got guys like Strap On Destiny who don't squat at all, but the issue again you run into is one of overall muscle balance, and that's a problem. The other thing we run into is when we come to the competitive end. What I would tell people, look, if the rules in any sport allow you to bend the rules to get an advantage, it would behoove you to do so. I mean, it comes down to, are you want to be a purist in a sport? Is it about that, or is it about winning? Well, sports are usually about winning, and if you can pull more sumo, and your sport allows for you to pull sumo, such as powerlifting does, and it should be noted that strongman does not, then obviously you're going to pull sumo. But the problem is that it gives people certain advantages, particularly shorter people, and shorter people already have the advantage in a weight class. In other words, a person who competes in the 181 class and they end up weighing in at 180 on the dot, and they have a similar body composition, meaning about the same body fat as someone else who's 5'9", say someone 5'6" versus 5'9", they're at a distinct advantage because they probably have slightly more muscle pound for pound. They move weights shorter distances. All right, you take something like the sumo deadlift, because plates are standardized in height. Deadlifting is easier for shorter people already. And what we oftentimes find is that the slightly shorter people get an even enormous, a much larger leverage advantage on the sumo. In other words, I've seen shorter people who can pull 550 sumo who can only pull 450 or 460 conventional, who train both. And I know that's an extreme case because a lot of people actually pull slightly more conventional depending upon their structure. But it gives them a massive leverage advantage. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're stronger, because if we do an apples to apples comparison lift, which is what, you know, strength sports are supposed to be, you're supposed to be doing a direct comparison, they would be tremendously weaker on the conventional. And what that essentially does is it allows people who have the leverage advantages to do sumo to focus purely on things like the squat and the sumo deadlift, and they don't have to do things to strengthen hamstrings and other stuff. It allows them to train differently, and it creates muscle imbalances and still dominate. So again, my solution there, I'm not against people doing sumo who get an advantage in doing so, because the rules allow for it. I would rather see in powerlifting it be an apples to apples comparison. Don't allow people to pull sumo. And I mean, that can be defined as the deadlift has to state that your hands have to be outside of your knees. They can't be inside of your knees. All right, that would resolve the problem, because then it would be the same lift. You know, it's for the same reason I don't like the excessive arching with super wide benching, because it cuts down the range of motion to where we're no longer allowing an apples to apples comparison. That one is more difficult to define in the rules. It really is, because we already have rules in place, such as, you know, your butt can't leave the bench. But as far as the flexibility of a person's arch, how do we determine that? I mean, the only way you could determine that would be to set up a measurement of how big of an arch they can have off the bench as far as how far their back can come off of the bench. Well, a really fat person then gets an advantage because they could arch more, and they're going to have more fat up top. So I don't know, and that would be harder. You got to have someone with a ruler there and a meet. Whereas in the sumo deadlift can be far more easily ruled out, like they've done in the strength lifting sport. So my point there is that I don't like it from a strength comparison perspective, because it's not the same lift. The exact same muscles aren't involved. It's a different range of motion, even in two people of the same height. So therefore, I'm not a fan of it in powerlifting. However, when people say, have you ever judged it differently? Nope. Because the rules state that it's allowed, when I've been a meet judge, I judge it by the exact same standard I do conventional, because that's the rule book. I try to be a very, very fair judge, and I set aside my personal biases. It meets that I have judged, simply because that's what you do. That's called being a good referee. You can dislike that a rule is there and still enforce it fairly. And you have to be that way. You have to be objective. But if I was given my choice, obviously sumo would be taken out of powerlifting, and it just is what it is. But as it stands, and the records that are set with it stand, and they are what they are. So those are my issues with the sumo deadlift. I don't hate it. I'm just biased towards conventional. And it's not because I pull more conventional. I can pull the same sumo. I've trained it. I've used it sometimes from time to time. This is a breakup, and I find I can pull just as much sumo without really training it as I can conventional. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.